I wanted to follow up on our last video, which was looking at what were the chances of having another child with autism if you'd already had one. And I wanted to look a bit more deeply and have a look at some of the studies and also give you some more facts and figures that might also be helpful. We know at Autism Partnership that it's a very, very challenging decision for families to make when they've already had a child with autism. Do they continue to build a larger family? They have to consider so many different variables. Is there treatment available where I live? Do we have the resources if the child does have autism? Are we ready for that challenge as we've already got one? Are we going to be able to manage as a family if we have two children with autism? I'm sure there are many, many, many more variables that parents have to think about in this very, very difficult decision-making process. Having some data from scientific studies, though, also helps you to know more about what is likely or more less likely to happen if you're about to have another child. The study I referenced in my last video was done in America. I picked this study because it's probably one of the biggest. In this study, it included 29,384 typically developing children and found 6,616 children with autism. And interestingly, this study was just looking at siblings of children with autism. One of the major problems with many of the studies that have already been done is that they look at general populations. And the problem is that if you're a parent or a family with a child with autism, you may decide not to have another child because you're worried that you might have another child with autism. They call this stoppage. And it's a phenomenon that you have to take into account because you don't know if those parents had had another child, would the child have had autism or not? So the prevalence rate may be actually much lower in those families that stopped. So this study looked specifically to eradicate that problem. As I mentioned in my previous video, prevalence rate in that study, if you had a child with autism already, was around 20% for the next one. There were also some other findings. They found that for parents that had a child with autism, if they were to have another child within the next 18 months, that the chances of that child having autism was higher than if they delayed that process to another 3 to 4 years. Another study that I think is of interest, which is much more recent, came from UC Davis from the Mind Institute, and this was published in 2024, so a very recent study. They also did a study in 2011 looking at exactly the same things, and some of the data was quite similar. Their sample size was much lower. It was only 1,605 children, and these are children they followed when a child with autism was going in for services. They would then track if they had a sibling that was younger, and they started that surveillance as young as 6 months up to 3 years to see whether that child would develop ASD. In that study, they found a very similar percentage, 20.2% of those siblings developed autism, but they also came up with some other facts that's relevant to know. Firstly, if you've had more than one child with autism, i.e. multiple siblings, the chances of the child having autism is much higher, around 37%. And they also found a correlation that if the first child was a girl, that the chances are that if your next child is a boy, that the chances of having autism in that child may be as high as 50%. So these are also very important numbers for families to consider when looking at these studies. I'll reference the studies below so you can have a much more of a look. There are many, many studies that have been conducted, but I think these three are probably the best that I've found. And you can have a closer look to see what they had to say.